Well, he is more or less exact contemporary with Bede in the north of England. He's probably a slightly younger contemporary of St. Maximus Confessor in the Greek tradition, and he belongs to the Church of the East. We actually know extremely little about his life, and for a long time it wasn't known which century he lived in, but then a document turned up which made it clear that he belongs to the second half of the 7th century. And we do know that he came from the region of Qatar, Beth Qatraye in Syriac. So it's the coastal area of the Gulf. And that's interesting in itself because we know quite a number of Syriac writers from the 7th century who have this background in Beth Qatraye. So this is a bit of a surprise, and it caused interest fairly recently because we had a conference actually in Qatar, arranged by the University of Qatar, on 7th century Syriac literature. So that was quite an event. I went there.
Wow.
Isaac, I think, got a bit of a look in, but not very much. And he was brought by his patriarch of the Church of the East, a man called Georgis, George, in probably 676 to Mesopotamia, and he was appointed Bishop of Mosul. The very short biographical note that we have says that after a few months he resigned and retired into the desert. We don't know why. The biography says God only knows the reason, and that's probably true. Well, it's certainly true. And where did he retire to? He retired to what is today southwestern Iran. And we know the name of the monastery to which he was attached, and the monastery of Rabban Shabor, who was a monk of a generation earlier, who founded a very successful monastic community. And he was basically a hermit, but attached to a monastery. So he would probably turn up in the monastery for the weekend, for the liturgy, the vigil on Saturday, and the Sunday liturgy, and then he'd disappear again. This was a common practice in the Church of the East at that time, and we have quite a lot of documentation about it. And there are two other writers who attached to that monastery, Dardesho, who's exact contemporary, and Shimon, who probably also an exact contemporary, but they have very much the same background. There's a lot of vocabulary in common, but their exact interrelationship we've absolutely no idea about. And Isaac is much the most famous of these writers. There was a monastic revival in the Church of the East in the 7th century or late 6th century. And so in the 7th century and 8th century, we have a number of very eminent monastic writers who write wonderful things. And Isaac is best known of them simply because he had the good fortune of having quite a lot of his writings translated into Greek around about 800 at the monastery of St. Saba in Palestine near Jerusalem. And once in Greek, of course, he got into many other languages, into Latin. He was in the late Middle Ages, he was quite well known in Latin, and then in various vernaculars in the 15th and 16th century, and then he got forgotten in the West. But in the East, the Greek was always very popular, masses of manuscripts, and right up to the present day, his very popular monastic reading, especially during Lent, and he got translated into Slavonic in the 15th, 14th century, and then ultimately in Russian in the 19th century, and is very popular in Russia too. So my one of two visits to Moscow, you could get the writings of Isaac on the station bookstore. So that's next door to a lot of pornography. There are. Anyhow, so Isaac is a well-known figure in the Christian East, but very little known. Now, I had the good fortune of finding some more writings of his in the Bodleian Library in Oxford in the, I suppose, the late 80s. And that got published. It's now not quite completely published because I took quite a big bit, but someone else was going to do the other, and that should be done fairly soon. But it's all available now in English as well as in many other languages, because it's actually quite controversial at the end. And when we come to your later question from Pope Francis's remark about hell, I'll tell you about that.
Okay, yeah.
So he's got into Romanian, into Arabic, and this is the second part, the new part, into Greek, of course, and into other languages, parts of it actually in Farsi. So you can see it's a wide Romanian too, very popular in Romania.
Wow.
So his and European languages, French and Arabic, and I think German, or certainly parts in German. So he's a writer who is clearly appreciated in that he has been, these translations are around. So the reason why he's popular, this is more difficult to say. I think it's probably because, certainly in my experience, he's the one monastic writer who is able to speak over the centuries. And although he's writing for a monastic audience, a lot of what he says is very relevant for any Christian layperson as well. And there's a very nice passage, which I might read, if I may, from, this is an Athonite novice monk who is given some Isaac to read. And when he's had a chance to read him, this is his reaction to the man, Archimandrite Basilius, who was the in one of the Athonite monasteries. And I think it's very telling, and this is really explains why he's so much of interest today still. So this novice says, I am reading St. Isaac the Syrian. I found something true, heroic, spiritual in him, something which transcends space and time. I feel that here, for the first time, is a voice which resonates in the deepest parts of my being, hitherto closed and unknown to me. Although he is so far removed from me in time and space, he has come right into the house of my soul. In a moment of quiet, he has spoken to me, sat down beside me. Although I've read so many other things, although I have met so many other people, and though today there are others living around me, no one else has been so discerning. To no one else have I opened the door of my soul in this way. Or to put it better, no one else has shown me in such a brotherly, friendly way that within myself, within human nature, there is such a door which opens onto a space which is open and unlimited. And no one else has told me this unexpected and ineffable truth, that the whole of this inner world belongs to human person.
It's a wonderful passage, and you quote it in your book, which I have here.
That's right.
Yeah,
yes,
yeah,
I
yeah.
was
No, I
reading that. I use it a lot because I think it does say a lot.
It's very powerful. Yeah. So maybe if we move on to what you alluded to earlier. So Pope Francis has recently made headlines for saying that he likes to think of hell as being empty. And this is a subject that I believe St. Isaac touches on as well. And I was wondering if you could explain his position a little bit.
Yes. Isaac doesn't speak of it being empty, but I suppose the hope of it being empty. In the early church, there are a number of fathers, and this goes back to St. Paul, who imply that at the sort of eschaton, the ultimate eschaton, all will be all. in God. And so that presupposes that Gehenna, hell, is not eternal. There's been a lot of argument about what the New Testament term eternal means. Does it mean eternity in time, or does it mean something else? Anyhow, Isaac is not particularly interested in what eternity is, but he is interested in the immensity of divine love. And this divine love must have a purpose, otherwise it wouldn't be divine love. And so right at the end of the second part, there are a number of chapters which deal with what he calls the mystery of Gehenna, indirectly and directly deals with this. And he is very emphatic that in any case, hell is not retribution. God does not pay you back for your sins. In fact, an earlier writer, Ephraim from the 4th century, has a wonderful work, a letter to a man called Publius, in which he meditates on the Last Judgment. And he points out that the judge is actually your own conscience. And that your conscience, as it were, stands aside as judge and judges you for all your bad deeds, your bad thoughts, your bad everything. So you yourself are the judge. So it's the moment of realization of how awful you have been, how distant from the love of God one has been. And it's this pain of separation from the love of God, which Isaac says is the real torment of hell. And he says the torment of hell is absolutely beyond description. I know you can't sort of describe it. It's not a sort of easy way out and with a good end. And anyhow, you don't know what the end is. Mm-hmm. Well, Isaac, because he's got so much emphasis on divine love, this divine love must have a purpose, and purpose of creation certainly was not to be defeated by human evil. And so that leads him to the conclusion that there is some mystery about Gehenna. It must have a purpose. It must have a good purpose. And what that end is, he doesn't say, of course, because he's no idea. It's a mystery. But the implication is that divine love will overcome somehow. How, he doesn't know. Somehow it will overcome Gehenna. And so the whole purpose of creation will be the whole purpose will, as we come to fruition, as God intended it. So that is basically how Isaac understands it. And I guess Pope Francis probably had read Isaac. He's sort of, as it were, anticipated the end, because, of course, if there is some divine end to Gehenna, and there is a good purpose, of course, hell will be empty, or be emptied at that point. So I think that's how to understand Pope Francis and how I would understand him. And I suspect he may have read Isaac. I don't know. It'd be interesting to know. What is important to emphasize is this view of universal salvation in the history of Christianity is often linked with positions about protology, what happened right at the beginning, and especially the origin of souls. Now, there were a number of positions which were actively condemned by the church, but it was the protology that got into trouble. Isaac is not interested in protology. He says nothing about that. So he is totally independent of that tradition.
Yeah.
But his position you'll find especially in Gregory of Nyssa, and a few other writers and Western writers like Julian of Norwich and many of the mystics too. So it's nothing completely new, but the way he approaches it is individual to him.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I certainly find a very appealing position. So you don't just study ancient Syriac manuscripts, you're also very involved with the Syriac churches around the world today. And I believe that Saint Isaac has a particularly interesting role, kind of an ecumenical role almost, in that he's read by all these various churches. But I was wondering if you could say something a little bit about your work with these churches and also just about these churches in general today, their position.
Yes, well, I did deal with the churches first. If you study Syriac, you have the great advantage and privilege of reading the Christological debates of the 5th, 6th century from all sides. So the Church of the East, you've got Syrian Orthodox, both non-Chalcedonian, and you've got the so-called Melkite Church, the Chalcedonian tradition, and that, of course, is the same as Catholic and Eastern Orthodox position. So if you are dealing with theological texts, you have to read these so you see all sides. And there's a wonderful medieval Syriac writer, Gregory Bar Hebraeus is known as, who was exact contemporary of Thomas Aquinas. And he was really the Syriac equivalent in the Church of the Syrian Orthodox Church of Thomas. And he writes these huge tomes on theology, very much in the scholastic tradition, because that's a common tradition to East and West, and that's something important to remember. And he says, he writes a book called Book of the Dove at the end of his life. And he says, having studied all these Christological arguments, he is convinced that although they conflict verbally, that underneath that they're all trying to say the same thing about the mystery of the incarnation and how to describe it. And I think he's absolutely right. One can see the point of each of these positions, provided you understand them from the point of view of that particular church that's producing them. The tragedy of the history is that people in the heat of the controversy picked on things that were, as it were, one stage further in the Christological spectrum, which were unsatisfactory, and supposed that that was the position of the church in question. So in the case of the Syrian Orthodox, the Chalcedonians argued that they had a Eutychian position. Well, the Syrian Orthodox have always condemned Eutyches just as much as everyone else. It's rather like what happens in modern politics. If you, especially in America, if you're a socialist, you're called a communist. And so it's just a matter of labeling with something that's your enemies is not to be tolerated, as it were, because of something that sounds terrible. Because having seen this from reading all these texts, I haven't read them all, of course, but I've read a lot of them. And for several years, I was an academic advisor at Pro Oriente in their Syriac dialogue. And that was very instructive for me because I could see ecumenism and the controversies surrounding the councils, as it were, at first hand. And it was also an interesting experience in that the first meeting was on Christology, was quite tense. And I suppose every side was wanting to stick to their historical position and not give way anyway. Well, it's not a matter of giving way, it's a matter of understanding the other. The second meeting was much better. And especially as we had the good fortune to have a very good bishop on the Syrian Orthodox side, very good bishop on the Church of the East side, who really knew their stuff. And it does need actually people who know the literature, because it's very complicated.
Mm-hmm.
And this was much more successful. And then the third meeting was, as it were, too successful, because when the reports went back to the two churches, one of the churches took fright.
Oh, no.
That's another matter. That was a sad thing. But in the official dialogue, the same things happened. And it's very instructive. You look at the history of the ecumenical dialogue between the Chalcedonian and the non-Chalcedonian churches. Very quickly, they come to the decision that on Christology, everyone is actually trying to say the same thing, but they are in different sort of linguistic, different theological traditions, and so they give different emphases and come to different verbal formulae. And provided you understand that, you don't have to accept the other and take it on yourself, but you do have to accept that it is a legitimate Orthodox position. And that, I think, is the key to how ecumenical dialogue on Christology should work. It's keep your own tradition, that's fine, but accept that the other traditions are equally Orthodox, but in a different Christological set of languages. Sorry, my cat is...
I have
He'll
a
probably
cat
turn up.
as well, actually.
What is the danger? You have one too.
Yeah.
Yes, mine's white if he appears. Well, the danger is he'll walk on the keyboard and
yeah, we don't want that.
And then there's chaos.
Yeah.
So now, why is Isaac important ecumenically? Monastic literature in general is very ecumenical. It's the one kind of literature that crosses ecumenical borders very easily. And Isaac belongs to the Church of the East, which has historically been called Nestorian, or that's a very unsatisfactory term, as I frequently try to point out. But from certain, as it were, very conservative points of view in the Chalcedonian tradition, both Western and Eastern, they would be, as it were, heretical. And the same with the Syrian Orthodox. Now, Isaac's writing actually has nothing on Christology. There are a few phrases which belong to the Eastern Christological tradition, which you might not find elsewhere, but not very many. Okay. So he's not interested in Christology. But what he says is of interest to monks everywhere, lay people everywhere. And so his writings got into Greek, quite a large body of, I forget, 67 homilies, discourses. And so that's the form he's been best known in until modern times, until this century. And the interesting thing is he got into Greek through, two stages. The first stage, he must have got into the Syrian Orthodox. The Syrian Orthodox actually took over a great deal of Eastern Church of the East monastic literature, and sometimes that literature only survives in Syrian Orthodox manuscripts. Well, Isaac must have got into the church, in the Syrian Orthodox Church, in the course of transmission, and at that point, a letter of Philoxenus of Marburg, one of the great Syrian Orthodox theologians of the 6th century, who would have been very unpopular, who was a great enemy, as it were, of the Church of the East. He gets a letter of his on monastic tradition, gets attached to Isaac's homilies. And also attached to Isaac's homilies are, I think it's 3 other discourses but this time from Church of the East writers from the next century, John of Daliatha, a wonderful writer. So, and then, so comes through the Syrian Orthodox tradition in a manuscript which has Philoxenus added, and these other two East Syriac authors. And then it gets into the Chalcedonian Syriac tradition. And we actually have a manuscript in the Vatican which belongs to that and is very similar in content to what gets into Greek. So when it gets into Greek, you have, so in Chalcedonian tradition, you have mainly Church of the East, that's Isaac and John of Daliatha, but you also have one treatise, a very important one, by Philoxenus of the Syrian Orthodox Church. So the moment he gets into Greek, he's, as it were, ecumenical, spanning all three. And the corpus is ecumenical, spanning all three traditions. And that's very pleasing in my view. But it's so true of many other monastic works. And it happens the other way. John, the Climax, John of the Ladder, he gets into Syriac, probably translated by Chalcedonian Syriac speakers. Then he gets taken up, not very often, but he does get taken up in the Syrian Orthodox Church, and so on. So this is how Isaac really cuts across, already in antiquity, the main Christological barriers. And in modern times, even more so, because in translation, he's read, well, all over the Christian world, where he's available in translation. And I know people from many different churches who find him very helpful. So he's someone who cuts through ecumenical barriers in a wonderful way. And that's why, personally, I think he's such a marvelous writer, quite apart from what he says, which I think is, I mean, he really has immense perception into the human psyche. And I think that that's so helpful in many cases. I would just encourage people to read him. Well worth it.
Right. And if I can just take one more minute of your time, and I'm very vaguely like yourself, but in a much more inept and much less profound way. I'm also started discovering in recent years some of the beauty and the wisdom that you can find in the Syriac churches. And I was just wondering if you have any advice for me as I kind of clumsily try to learn a bit more about this wonderful tradition. And
yes, well, personally, I find the early writing, especially the poetry, is what greatly attracts me. Ephraim, if you haven't read any Ephraim, do read Ephraim. Okay. I tried to, Ephraim's quite difficult poem. It's a bit like John Donne. You have to, if you want some sort of help, I wrote a book called The Luminous Eye, which tries to present Ephraim for the modern reader. And he has a sort of substructure on which he builds, but he never tells you what that substructure is. And I try and sort of elicit from his writings. It was actually a set of lectures I gave in Rome to one of the Indian institutes in 1985. They got written up in India and eventually got published again in America, the Cistercian publications.
Yeah, I think I have a
But Ephraim, I find he's a real wonderful poet. He's a wonderful theologian. And I just like his approach.
Yeah.
He approaches through symbols, through paradoxes. So it's quite the opposite sort of analytic approach to theology. It's sort of complementary. It's not an alternative, but it's complementary, and it's a complementary to very much in the medieval Western tradition. Though in the medieval Western tradition, there's lots of wonderful poetry. I think it's the poetry that is provides this way in to the mystery of Christianity, and but because I suppose academic theology has had such a huge influence, especially in the West.
Yeah,
it's sort of dominated it too much. But it needs to be, both sides are very important.